So I really love the Monster Hunter series, but one thing it's always struggled with is that it can be pretty intimidating to try out if you've never played one of the games before. With the newest one, Monster Hunter Rise, coming out recently, I figured it would be a good idea to do a review of the game specifically for people who haven't played any of the past entries. I'm going to talk about what the general appeal of the game is, how this one is structured and some of the cool new features it has, as well as briefly go over some of the stuff that's put people off in the past and what this game does to try and address that. So what's the game about? Well, you are a hunter living in a place called Kimura Village, and it's your job to keep it safe by taking on quests to take out some of the dangerous monsters that roam the land. You always start in Kimura and you pick which quest you want to do. You then head out to one of the large locales where you have to track down your target monster. You then fight it for a bit, and once the deed is done, you get rewarded with some of the monster's parts, like its horns or its claws. Back in Kimura, you can then take those parts to the blacksmith to make new weapons or armour. You can then use that gear to take on even stronger monsters. This is the core gameplay loop. You fight, you loot, you upgrade, and then you go back to fight stronger monsters. When I say it like that, it sounds pretty simple and straightforward, but there's three general components that make this loop so fun and addicting. I'll call them the combat design, the enemy or monster design, and the charming details of everything in between. Starting with combat, there are 14 different weapon types in the game, and each one has its own control scheme and style of play. If you spent your valuable time studying the blade, then use the quick and stylish longsword. Or if Unga Bunga is more your style, then use the hammer to knock out monsters clean. There's weapons for slow or fast play styles, there's ranged weapons, there's weapons that can transform into other weapons, there's even musical instruments. There's pretty much an option for any way you want to play. And on top of all this variety, each weapon has so much depth and utility to them that you'll learn through playing. Let's look at the longsword as an example of this. Out of the gate, you'll be learning some of the basic combos. It's got some overhead swings, some pokes, a cool dodge slash move. It's nothing too flashy, but it does get the job done. As you get more comfy using it, you'll start thinking about the weapon's spirit gauge mechanic, which lets you increase damage by performing a specific combo to temporarily level up your sword. Once you get the hang of that, you can start messing around with the countering abilities that the weapon has, which of course let you counter a monster's attacks, but it also lets you level up your sword much faster. If that's all sounding like a bit too much, then there's two things to bear in mind here. First of all, you really don't need to go into this much depth to have fun playing. Each quest gives you a really generous time limit, so if you want to just keep things simple, the option is there and you can just learn the depth completely at your own pace. You're never rushed into it. Secondly, not every weapon has mechanics as advanced as a longsword. I just picked it as an example because it's the weapon that the game starts you with, and it's one of the most popular weapons. There's plenty of other choices that are much simpler, like the hammer, and some that are even more complicated, like the charge blade. After you've been playing for a while though, you'll probably naturally start to gravitate towards wanting to learn the advanced tech of your chosen weapon, for the simple reason that it's incredibly fun and rewarding to pull off some of these techniques. A lot of these weapon mechanics are unique and can't really be found in any other game, and they've been tweaked and refined over the years to offer an airtight combat experience. But of course, all these cool weapons and mechanics are nothing without the second component, the monster design. Monsters are a bit like traditional bosses in that they have a lot of health, they hit hard, and they have more interesting movesets than a regular enemy type would in another action RPG game. Once you fight some of these guys though, you might find that comparison a bit unfair, and you'll judge bosses in other games a lot more harshly, because each fight here is designed incredibly well. Before we get into that though, the first thing that makes fighting these guys so appealing is their looks. There's a great variety of monsters here, and each one looks really unique and appealing. The series has always strived to have interesting creatures that still have some air of realism to them, which help keep them grounded and believable in their environments, and make the more fantastic elements really pop. But of course, looks aren't everything, so it's a good thing these guys have the moves to back it all up. Every monster has its own unique moveset, which can be really varied and give each monster enough kit to be engaging and thrilling fights that really keep you on your toes. When you first come across a monster, you'll probably approach it hesitantly, slipping in some quick attacks while you learn how it moves and attacks you. As the fight goes on, you'll start to notice where there are openings for you to really go on the offensive, and conversely, when are the times you need to play more defensively. The fights are really like dances, with a constant back and forth between the two of you that is just a blast to play. Some monsters even have advanced mechanics that you'll have to figure out how to deal with too. You'll see the electric wolf Zinogre charging himself up throughout the fight. If you don't stagger him out of this charging, then he'll get enough to power himself up and become supercharged, infusing his attacks with thunder and making him a lot more dangerous. The only way to get him out of it though is to deal enough damage to him, forcing you to go on the offensive at a time you'd logically start playing more defensively. It's stuff like this that really separates the monsters from traditional boss encounters in other games, and it makes it all the more rewarding when you finally learn enough about them to take them down. The last component that makes the game so appealing is the charming detail of everything in between. Now that might sound like a bit of a cop-out to talk about two concrete things and then just say everything else as the last point, but I'm wording it this way because it's really the charm and the vibe in between the combat that acts like the glue to tie everything together, and it elevates that core gameplay loop from a mechanically solid base to something with a bit more soul. Take your village base of Komura for example. For such an action-focused game, there's such a friendly and peaceful atmosphere to the place where you hang out between your hunts. People go about their routines, have friendly conversations with you, and just generally have a good time. It's always exciting to run up to the blacksmith after you've just beat a new monster to see what he can make with the new parts. Every design for the weapons and armour incorporates something about the monster's personality in an interesting way, which makes them a lot more than just straight stat changes. You can order food from the chef, hang pictures you've taken in your house, check on your cats and dogs and pick which ones you want to bring with you on the next hunt. It's the style and detail to all of this and more that really makes the whole experience more than just the sum of its parts. So that's what I would say are the main three components that make the game so appealing. And maybe you've already decided if the game is for you or not based on that. If you're not convinced yet, next I'll go over some of the cool things that Rise specifically has added to the formula of the series. First of all, we now have wirebugs, which are these little beetles whose silk lets you do all sorts of cool things. You can swing, jump and move around far more than you could in past games, which has led to a knock-on effect of the maps being designed in really interesting ways. You can have fun just exploring and moving around the map, which is surprising and something that you really wouldn't have said about some of the older games. They also let you do all sorts of cool flashy special moves, which are usually really strong and add another element to the combat. You can also use these wirebugs to jump on top of monsters and puppet them around, which is really fun. Each monster has its own unique moves and effects that you can use to fight other monsters with, so it's a really fun way of dishing out some good damage to your target monster. There's a new type of game mode called Rampage too, which is a bit like a tower defense game. Here you set up defenses and traps to fend off waves of monsters, with the goal being preventing them from breaking the final gate that leads into Komura village. The Rampage adds some good variety, and there's even some monsters that can only be found in this mode, like the strong Apex monsters. There is of course a bunch more stuff, but I think for newcomers those are some of the highlights. The last thing I wanted to cover was some of the common questions or issues that can put newcomers off from trying the game. First of all, the series has a reputation for being difficult, so how's Rise? Well, it's a pretty subjective question, but I'd say Rise is one of the most friendly games for newcomers. You can take quests from two areas, the village and the hub. Quests that you take in the village have been balanced so that the monsters don't take too long to beat, meaning there's less time to make mistakes and therefore it's easier to succeed. The game unfortunately bombards you with a lot of tutorials and information early on, which might feel like too much to take in. They're all stored in your notes if you want to check back on them in future though, and channels here on YouTube like RX and Gaijin Hunter have some really good videos to help you along if you'd prefer to learn that way. I've put a link to their channels in the description of this video. Overall, the game has quite a good difficulty curve, maybe even the best the series has ever had, which means that when the more challenging monsters do show up, they don't just slap you down immediately. Quests you take in the hub are also balanced more like a traditional Monster Hunter game, so the idea seems to have been to get new players to get comfortable with the village quests and then have them move on to the more challenging hub quests when they feel ready. There's no difficulty setting you can change yourself, so I think this was a pretty good way of handling this issue. Next, is the game fun to play on your own? A lot of people see Monster Hunter as a cooperative game. Quests taken from the hub can be played with up to 4 players, and it can be a lot of fun. Having said that though, you definitely don't need to have friends to play with to enjoy the game. If the appeal I outlined earlier sounds good to you, you'll have no problem having fun playing solo. If you do decide to play online, but don't have people you know to do it with, then matchmaking has been streamlined so that it's incredibly easy to play with random people. You can use a board in the Gathering Hub to pick from all of your available quests. Once you've picked one, the game will search for others who are already in that quest. If there's one ongoing, then you'll automatically join. There's no need for the occasionally confusing systems that some of the past games had. Another thing you might wonder about is if there's a story mode, or if you have to have played the past games to get Rise. There is a story, but you definitely don't need to have played any of the past games to understand what's going on. The story of Rise is completely self-contained and makes no reference to anything that happened in past games. This is because all of the past Monster Hunter games have been extremely light on story, and Rise is no exception to this. It's only really there to add a bit of intrigue around certain monsters and to provide some context to what's happening in the world between your hunts. With that in mind, if you play games just for their stories and don't care about the gameplay as much, then you probably won't enjoy Monster Hunter. The last thing I'm going to recommend you do is to check out the demo from the eShop. There are some training tutorials and quests for 3 different monsters of varying difficulty. Even if you've decided at this point that the game sounds good to you, it can't hurt to try it out like this for free and really get a feel for it. The only thing to bear in mind is that you can't customize any of your equipment, so you miss out on feeling what the entire gameplay loop is like, but of course the combat clicking is the most important part anyway. If after all of this you decide that the game just isn't for you, no worries. Sometimes stuff just doesn't click for us the way it does for other people, and that's okay. If you're still on the fence and have any questions, let me know in the comments and I'll try and help out with that. And if you do decide to get the game, then I hope you have a great time with it and enjoy it as much as I have been.